It's time now for French Connections, our in-depth look at the intricacies of French life. And we have Florence Villeneuve with us on the set to help us do that today. Hi, Flo. Today you're going to focus on the French police. And this is an idea that came from a tweet from one of our viewers.
That's right. Let's take a look at this question. This is from Cinéaste68, who wants to know, Gendarmerie, Police Nationale, Police Judiciaire, Police Municipale, confused, explain law enforcement on French Connection. So that's what I'm going to try to do, Cinéaste68. I'm going to try to break this down for you because broadly speaking, the French police are known as les gardiens de la paix, essentially the guardians of peace. But it's true that if you take a closer look, it's quite complex, starting with the fact that at the national level, France has two police forces. You have the Police Nationale and the Gendarmerie Nationale.
Now, these are separate police agencies, but they have kind of the same role, but different jurisdictions.
That's right. Let's take a closer look at the differences. First of all, the Police Nationale, which was formerly called La Sûreté, it's a civilian police force. It operates in major cities like Paris and large urban areas. It's under the control of the Minister of the Interior, and its strength is roughly 145,000 police officers. Now, well, how about the Gendarmerie Nationale? Well, that is actually part of the French armed forces, and it has a very different zone of authority, smaller towns and rural areas. Now, the Gendarmerie is under the control of both the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of the Interior, and it has about 98,000 soldiers, or gendarmes as they're called. So the existence of these two forces with very similar goals but different jurisdictions has created friction and competition between the two at times. And it must be said that there have been calls to merge them into one single force, which would make it a lot less confusing, wouldn't it? But it must be said there are a lot of advantages to having these two separate police forces because, first of all, it gives the government options when it comes to law enforcement. For instance, in France, the military is not allowed to go on strike. So if the Police Nationale decides to go on strike, well, the government can always resort to the gendarmerie for law enforcement.
The gendarmerie, which is the more military type of police force. Now, on top of all of that, you also have local police, which is another separate police force.
That's right. It had to be just a little bit more confusing, didn't it? This is the Police Municipale. It's the third component of French policing. Now, these are local police officers, and they're under the direct authority of the mayor in towns and cities. There are about 18,000 of them across the country. And what's interesting is they don't have as much power as the national police. And on top of that, they're not systematically armed. Only about 45% of them actually carry weapons, well, firearms. It all depends on the local mayor. And it must be said that there have been calls to change this in the wake of the recent terrorist attack.
Now, in fact, a lot has changed for the police since the recent terrorist attacks and the subsequent state of emergency that we're still in. The current police staff is stretched to the limit. The government's trying now to find different ways to beef up the forces. What are they doing?
That's right. You might remember that just a couple of days after the November 13th attacks, the president, François Hollande, he promised to recruit an additional 5,000 police and gendarmes. Now, what's interesting is applications really skyrocketed. A lot of people have wanted to join the police in the wake of the recent incidents. Let's actually listen to what motivated one young man to try and sit the exam.
The recent terrorist attacks really shocked me. I wanted to join the police to protect the country we live in. When the police were applauded by the French, it was really powerful. That was the nudge I needed.
Now, what that young man just mentioned is really important because for a long time here in France, French people actually had a very negative view of the police, but that is starting to change.
That's right. A lot of French people have traditionally had a negative view of the police because of, say, darker chapters in the history of French policing. For instance, there was elements of collaboration during World War II. Also, their very heavy-handed repression of the May 68 uprising, the cultural uprising we've already talked about here on French Connections. Now, like in many other countries, there are a lot of slang words to talk about the police. This is one that's quite common, poulet, chicken, which I guess you could say is the French equivalent of the American insult pig when referring to police. But public opinion has really changed in the last couple of months since the January attacks, because remember, several police officers have been killed in the recent terrorist attacks. And you can see this is a slogan that became quite famous in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Je suis Charlie, je suis policier, I am a police officer. And in fact, let's listen to the top cop, the Interior Minister, Bernard Cazeneuve, explaining where this kind of unusual show of affection for the police comes from.
French people are proud of the national police and gendarmerie. You are at the front line in the fight against terrorism and crime. The French people have witnessed the sacrifices you are willing to make to protect them.
Now, it must be said this honeymoon between the French and the police has been a little bit tainted in recent months. During the recent labor law protests, there were claims that the police was being quite brutal, repressing protesters quite violently. But despite this criticism, a recent opinion polls suggest that over 8 out of 10 French people, so over 80% of French people, have a positive opinion of the police. So you can see it's quite complicated. I hope I explained some of this and answered your question, Cineast68.
Florence, thank you so much for that. And thanks to you, Cineast68, for sending us that question. Now, if you want to ask another question of Florence Villeminot to find out more in the next French Connections, please send her a tweet at Flo Villeminot, and she will be sure to get back to you on any question you might have about all of the intricacies of French life.